It's just before Christmas in 1977. A teen boy takes his girlfriend to the high school holiday dance in Hernando, Mississippi, and borrows his brother's car for the night to drive around. He promises to make his curfew, something he's never failed to uphold. He safely drives his girlfriend home, but something happened between pulling out of her driveway and getting back to his because neither he nor his brother's vehicle would ever be seen again. Some speculate he could have driven his car into a body of water and it just hasn't surfaced yet. But those close to him believe that this was a hate crime and that something sinister happened to him that late December night as a black man driving on the back roads of Mississippi. In the nearly 47 years since that night, some of his family members have passed away, but there are still many who so badly want answers in their lifetime. They believe that someone out there knows who hurt Jerry but has been scared to come forward, and they hope that with this passage of time, they will sit with their conscience and find it in themselves to bring their family much deserved answers. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved disappearance of Jerry Lee Armstrong. Hernando, Mississippi, a small town 25 miles south of Memphis, Tennessee, just over the Mississippi border. Hernando holds the seat of DeSoto County and is named after Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto. According to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, de Soto was the first European to describe the Mississippi River. On his 1541 quest for gold, he passed through uncharted areas of the southeast and made contact with Native Americans. Well, that's putting it nicely. The land on which Hernando now sits was once the home of the Chickasaw and Choctaw tribes of northwestern Mississippi. Hernando was called Jefferson when it was settled in 1832 and then incorporated as the municipality of Hernando in 1836. Hernando de Soto was a violent, evil man who grew wealthy as a prolific slave trader and who displaced Native American tribes, often forcing the men to show them the land and abducting women to sexually assault and exploit and, quote, give them over, end quote, to his men. Hernando's proximity to the Mississippi River made it a prime agricultural mecca and helped its population grow. After the Civil War, Mississippi remained a violent place for African Americans during Reconstruction and beyond. The birth of the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, began immediately after the Civil War. Klansmen sought to overthrow state governments in the South by way of voter intimidation and targeted violence against African Americans. The secretive members would make their own colorful costumes and pointed hats to enact violence and hide their identities. After 1915, it branched out further, gaining even more traction after the 1920 film Birth of a Nation. Extending into the Midwest, this faction of the KKK sought to maintain white supremacy and also hated Jewish people as well as the political power of the Pope and the Catholic Church. This sector did things like burn crosses and continue with voter intimidation and violence and murder against minority groups. And while this membership died down, there was again a resurgence in the 1950s of a third variation of the KKK. This is still active to this day. While these KKK groups were smaller and isolated, they formed dangerous alliances with small-town police offices and officials in office in the South. Opposing the civil rights movement and desegregation, the KKK during this time would murder civil rights workers and, in general, any black citizens they came across whom they could harm and get away with. They quite literally got away with murder repeatedly for decades. I'm obviously giving a very, very limited, high-level overview of the complexities of this domestic terrorist organization, but the reason I'm spending this amount of time on the back history is to set the stage for this story. Jerry Lee Armstrong was a young black teen in rural Mississippi in 1977. While Hernando's population overall had declined because people had sought jobs in Memphis, this was a time where Klan membership had jumped from 6,500 to 10,000 in just a few years across the country. Not to mention the estimated 75,000 Klan sympathizers who promoted their literature and ideology but were just not card-carrying members. While we know hate crimes still happen today as well, the prevalence of them in this area of the country during this time was significantly higher. I'll come back to that more in a minute, but first let's talk about the night Jerry went missing. Jerry was a 17-year-old at the time and living with his family in Hernando. He had a good job at a gas station in Coldwater, Mississippi. He was a great student and the star of the football team. He was actually the starting quarterback. He was very close with his family and had a steady girlfriend. In fact, on December 23, 1977, he was planning on taking her to the dance. He had asked his older brother James if he could borrow his car for the evening. It was a white two-door Pontiac Le Mans with red and black racing stripes on the side. He thought this sporty car would impress his girlfriend, and he felt proud to drive her to the dance in it. While we don't know for sure the impact of this decision, many people think it was a fateful one. So, on that evening, he said goodbye to his family. He took the car, which was filled with presents in the trunk for his siblings for Christmas that was just about to happen in a couple of days. He promised to be back by midnight, and this was something he always kept his word on. Off he went in his dark green suit, yellow shirt, green tie, and black shoes with stacked heels. Jerry left Hernando and drove to pick up his girlfriend. She lived northeast near the town of Lewisburg in a little community called Dark Corner. I'll have a picture of this on our Instagram at simplertimecrimepod. It's rural even to this day. He then would have taken Route 269 and driven back west to Hernando to the National Guard Armory where the dance was taking place. Jerry's girlfriend confirmed all of this, and from everything out there, it sounds like it was a great evening. He dropped her back home to her home near the intersection of Byhalia and Craft Roads at sometime around 11 p.m. And then he was gone. When he didn't arrive home by 12:30 in the morning, his parents immediately panicked. He was never late, and the next morning, when he still wasn't home, they went to police. From the get-go, his family felt the investigation wasn't taken seriously. Police basically said they would look into it, but his family never saw much of an investigation develop. In fact, the police jumped to the notion that Jerry had run away. But that didn't make any sense. He literally had presents in the back of his car for Christmas. He was the star of the football team, as we mentioned. He had his girlfriend, he had his job, and he was set to graduate high school that year. Still, police seemed unmotivated to put a large-scale search out there for him. And Jerry's family had their own suspicions. The first thought they had was that someone could have targeted Jerry because they were unhappy that a black kid was the star quarterback of the football team. His brother Johnny has said in interviews that a lot of people were unhappy with this decision, and they thought this could have made him a target. Although he was athletic, Jerry was only about 5'6" and 145 pounds, so he could have been overtaken by someone or someones fairly easily. The next theory they had was still along the lines of being targeted because of his race, but with a different twist. They thought it may have been a case of mistaken identity. You see, his brother James, whom he borrowed the car from, was dating a white woman during this time, and that was causing quite a stir. It was something that had angered many people in town because interracial dating was not widely accepted, especially in this area of the country at that time. And it was said that the KKK was heavily active one county over and possibly right within DeSoto County. The fact that he was driving his brother's car may have meant that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Those who knew his brother was dating a white woman may have sought to harm him, and he was just collateral damage in this because he was driving his brother's car. And that isn't all. James actually died just a few years after Jerry's disappearance in what would be considered a very suspicious death. He died by a gunshot wound, which police ruled was by suicide. However, the gunshot wound was to his chest. While not unheard of, this is a pretty rare method of suicide. Also, he had not acted depressed or expressed any intentions of suicide, and there was no suicide note. But to this day, that's how his death was ruled, and that's what it says on his death certificate, despite his family's objections. One thing that is especially noteworthy is that the car disappeared with Jerry, which is a telling clue. Jerry's family believed it was possible that on the drive home, Jerry encountered a KKK roadblock. This was not uncommon at the time in this area and would have gotten him into danger quickly. If he was blocked off by several vehicles, he could have been abducted and murdered by being overpowered quickly. His car could have been disposed of by being buried, taken to a scrapyard, taken to a landfill, or driven into a body of water. These were all rumors that his family has heard over the years. And with the passage of time, Jerry's family was and continues to be relentless in pursuing answers in his disappearance. They called hundreds of people, including people who attended the dance, fellow teammates, locals. They independently followed up on any lead they could because they felt like law enforcement wasn't doing this themselves, so they had to take matters into their own hands. His brother Johnny often took the lead, and one day he received a phone call that fueled his suspicions. A couple of years after Jerry's disappearance, a male voice on the other end of the line called him the N-word and said, quote, "You're going to tell those investigators to back off or you are next. We're going to kill you." End quote. The threatening phone call prompted Johnny and his family to contact the FBI and get them involved, and they have been ever since. In 2007, 30 years after Jerry's disappearance, Mississippi Bureau of Investigation's detective Peter Clinton was working the case. He confirmed in an interview that they continued to work with the FBI in working the case. He had some interesting observations as he dug back in and was going through old case files. He said, first of all, that even after all of these years, people seemed absolutely terrified to come forward and unwilling to talk or be re-interviewed or shed any light. People were very afraid to discuss his case. He also dropped a bombshell. He said that at the time, the FBI was doing a secondary investigation into complaints of witness intimidation. And who was intimidating these witnesses? According to an article in the DeSoto Times, he said, quote, "Some of the witnesses have been intimidated by the law enforcement up there," end quote. So yes, you heard that correct. The local law enforcement seemed to be hiding something. And they were trying to pressure witnesses into not talking. A more recent investigating officer found that certain documents valuable to the investigation had gone missing from the case file. What specifically, we don't know. But that's enough to draw what conclusions you will. Again, this was not uncommon. In Mississippi, there was a long history of KKK members involved in cover-ups tied to law enforcement and other high-ranking officials. And honestly, maybe this person wasn't officially a member of the KKK, but perhaps just a racist cop or a racist person or persons that Jerry encountered. One other thing to note about the KKK during this time was that the 1960s and then thereafter had the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and that was birthed in Mississippi and Louisiana, but most prominent in Mississippi. And that is considered the most dangerous faction of the KKK. They have a horrific history. I will link some information to it in the show notes, but during this time, they were active in Mississippi and committed just awful crimes. The White Knights were responsible for bombings, church burnings, beatings, murders, and particularly the murder of several civil rights workers. In fact, the film Mississippi Burning is based around the events of the White Knight murders of the civil rights workers. So the fact that this faction was harming people on this scale means that harming a boy driving home in the middle of the night would have been nothing to them. In 2009, there was hope that there may be some answers in the case. Skeletal remains were found along a riverbank about 60 miles north of Hernando. The remains and how long they had been there fit the profile of possibly being a match. However, when Jerry's family submitted DNA, it was not a match to Jerry. I wasn't able to find if they were ever able to solve who that John Doe was. The only one I could find from that area was from 2001, so it's possible that the one from 2001 is who they were comparing him to. But anyways, if anyone is familiar with that John Doe in that area and has an answer, please send me a message. I am curious. Now, there's one possibility we haven't explored yet. Is it possible that Jerry drove into a body of water on accident and he and his car just haven't been found? This is a surprisingly common outcome for people who go missing with their vehicles. And now there are a few organizations and individual people who do this kind of work searching for these people whose cars have gone into water with them. They do this as a public service. Adam Brown Adventures, Texas EquiSearch, and Adventures with a Purpose all come to mind. These services have used their unique skill set to find dozens of people who have gone missing and their cars and be able to provide at least some sense of closure to families, sometimes many years later. And just to give you an idea, Adventures with a Purpose has only been doing it since around 2019, and I believe they have found around 35 people. So that just shows you that volume. You can follow the YouTube channel that they have, and that shows you their whole process and what they do to find these old cars that have been submerged for years. Jerry would have passed so many small ponds and bodies of water on his drive home. A larger body of water that he would have passed would have been the Coldwater River. It would have been directly on his route, and I'll share a photo of it on Instagram, but it's very murky, and I think it would be very difficult to see if anything had been submerged in there. No matter what, it's my personal opinion that waterways should be searched thoroughly in this area because whether Jerry was murdered or suffered a tragic accident, either scenario would lend a high likelihood that he and his brother's car are in a body of water somewhere. So I would love to see one of those organizations get involved, and if you're a listener who knows the best way to get in contact and make that happen, feel free to share this episode with them or reach out with information, share the VICAP flyer or any of the missing persons flyers with them, and have them take a peek at this case because I think it could be a really good one for them to explore. It's also a possibility that the outcome where he went into the water is a combination of the two. So perhaps he was chased in his vehicle by someone who was of the KKK, or just people seeking to intimidate or scare him, and he lost control of his car and went into the water. Or he was being chased and he was forced off the road into the water. Really, it's so hard to tell, but I think finding his body and finding the car would shed some light on that. Jerry's mother died in 1987, shy of her 50th birthday. Her son said that she died of a broken heart. She longed every day, just begging her son to come back. As of 2019, his father was in his 80s and still alive, but I can't confirm if he still is today. He has surviving siblings who continue to push for answers in his case. While intimidation is a completely understandable thing 5, 10, 20, even 30 years out, I understand that fear, but now almost 50 years have passed. It's time to solve this for his family and let them have peace in at least knowing what happened to their loved one. If Jerry were still alive today, he would be 64 years old. He has a small scar over his left eye, and the car he was driving had Mississippi license plates DAY 485. If you have any information on the disappearance of Jerry Lee Armstrong, no lead is too small. Please contact the DeSoto County Sheriff's Department at 662-469-3029. You can also contact your local state police or the FBI. I know this case has been a shorter case with not a lot of concrete details or directions to go on. But the fact is, Jerry's case at best was not taken seriously by police and at worst was covered up by police. But cases like Jerry's deserve coverage just as much as the ones that have so much information I can barely fit it into a 1-hour episode. So I'll continue to share these cases as well, because their families long for answers just as much. This has been a Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts and spread the word about this podcast. Word of mouth helps more than anything else for me, and I truly appreciate it. It means the world to me when I hear by word of mouth that a friend of a friend of a friend told somebody and that they've listened to my podcast and they love it. Tune in Monday for another cold case, and thank you so much for listening.